For the third question, what should we do first? First, let's look at the question. The question asks, which of the following, if true, would most effectively undermine the archaeologist's hypothesis? All right, so when we look at the passage, we need to pay special attention to what the hypothesis is, because that should be the conclusion of the passage or the main argument. Now, let's look at what the passage says. It says, activation of the ancient city of K on the island of C revealed a pattern of debris and collapsed buildings typical of towns devastated by earthquakes. He says, the scholars, they are excavating this city, the ancient city of No. This ancient city of K is on the island of C. So during the excavation, they discovered something, a typical pattern. What kind of pattern? Namely, debris and collapsed buildings. So what is this pattern? It closely resembles the kind of destruction typically caused by an earthquake. In other words, what we found at this site during excavation, ruined walls and broken structures looks very much like the aftermath of an earthquake. So archaeologists began to speculate. This major destruction is the great disaster we now see reflected in these fragments and ruins. Was it caused by a major earthquake in 365 AD? There are two logical issues with this. The first problem is that you only told me earlier that what you unearthed looks like earthquake damage. There are broken walls and severed limbs. But here's the problem. Why can you directly attribute this to the earthquake in 365 AD? Earthquakes don't just happen once. There have been many throughout history. Why are you linking it specifically to that one? So you need to prove to me that the timing can actually be matched up. Next, the second point is that you're just telling me that the broken walls and ruins are typical of towns devastated by earthquakes, as if these are typical signs of earthquake destruction. However, you haven't ruled out the possibility that there could be other causes. There could be other reasons besides earthquakes that cause broken walls and ruins. For example, in the case of Daobao, it was destroyed by war. So that's another possible explanation. This is what we call using hidden assumptions to explain things. Actually, I forgot to write that part here. Now, the third point. So how can we prove that it really happened in the year 365? So either there needs to be some new evidence, some other new evidence that really proves it's actually related to the year 365. And this new evidence must connect the earthquake specifically to this location. Now, let's take a look at these options and see which one addresses this logic. Let's start with the first option. It says there are some bronze water vessels, okay, that are often found in graves dating from years preceding and following 365 were also found in several graves and near K. So in some cemeteries nearby, note, these are cemeteries they found bronze water vessels. And what about these water vessels? They are often borrowed, often seen in graves from the years before and after 365. Even though you mentioned 365, you're pointing out a specific time. But here's the problem. The time you're highlighting is meaningless. Why? Because both before and after that year, these things are present. What we want to see today is either only before or only after. But you're telling me that this evidence exists both before and after. So how can you use it to demonstrate consistency in practice? If you want to prove, let's say today, you want to prove that. To prove the 365 earthquake, you must show that before 365, luxury goods were abundant. And after 365, only items used by the poor remained. This would prove destruction likely occurred around 365 as society suddenly became impoverished. Or, for example, before 365, there were tall buildings. And after 365, those tall buildings disappeared, right? Only then can you really prove that it actually happened in 365. But you can't use something that existed both before and after 365 to prove that something happened at that time. Option A simply can't achieve what we want in a single step. As for option B, it says that after 365, no coins minted in this place have been found. However, there are plenty of coins minted before 365. Doesn't this match what we just talked about? If the disaster really happened in 365, then it's clear that there should have still been normal activity here before 365. And of course, normal activity would include minting coins, right? So if there were a lot of coins before and the disaster happened in that year, then after 365, the coinage here might have stopped and the remaining coins would have been destroyed, right? That's why there are fewer coins from after that time. So this might be connected to the logic we just discussed. First, it needs to match the timeline before and after 365, right at that point in time. Second, what logic does it use? It also uses the argument from absence. That is to say, all right, if there was a disaster then society would have ceased its activities. Conversely, if society was active, it means there probably wasn't any disaster at that time, right? So here, not only is the logic of temporal consistency used, but also the so-called argument from absence. If there had been a disaster, there shouldn't be any signs of social activity. Conversely, if there was no period without activity, that means there was activity. This suggests there probably wasn't a disaster then. So if there are normal signs of social activity before 365, it indicates no disaster. But if there are no signs of activity after 365, that could serve as evidence a disaster had already occurred. That's why option B remains plausible. Now, let's look at option C. Most modern historical records. The records state that there was an earthquake on the island around the year 365 AD, which makes this a bit tricky. That's actually why I will keep this option for consideration. Because having records can be considered a form of testimonial evidence. But to be honest, this kind of testimonial evidence is not entirely trustworthy. Why is that? Because this testimonial evidence isn't from people at the time. It's from modern people. When we see modern models, it refers to the present day. But 365 AD and the present are more than 1,700 years apart. That's quite a gap, right? For example, people from the Song dynasty might say that King Zhou of Shang was very cruel, and they talk about it as if they saw it themselves. But in reality, they might just be repeating what others have said, exaggerating it layer by layer. So testimonial evidence is not stronger than physical evidence. And even accounts written by good people are not stronger than physical evidence. And here's the key point. Physical evidence consists of things left behind from that time, and the timeline is consistent. But with testimonial evidence, the timeline is not consistent. So option C is a relatively weak choice. If there is no physical evidence, then testimonial evidence is acceptable. But if there is physical evidence, we shouldn't consider testimonial evidence, especially when its timeline is inconsistent. All right. So the biggest problem with option C is that its timeline is inconsistent. You're using the testimony of modern people or history written by people today to talk about what happened back then. So whose account should we trust? All right. So where option B is better than option C, aside from being physical evidence, is that its timeline is consistent with the period in question. It's not modern research, it's evidence from that time. Okay, so what about the multiple choice options? Let's talk about that here at point K. What exactly did we find? We found several small ancient statues, and the artistic style used for these particular statues is roughly from between the years 300 and 400. But isn't this option the very same as option A we just discussed? 300 to 400 years, this range includes both before and after 365. And there are foreign precedents as well. It has the same logical flaw as option A. You simply can't prove the uniqueness of the time to us, right? Not the consistency of the timing, correct? What we need to prove is whether an earthquake actually happened in the year 365. But instead, you're telling me about things that happened before 365 and after 360. There are statues everywhere, so what exactly are you trying to prove about the year 365? Now, what does option E say? Option E says that in this place, they found some stone well, some carved inscriptions. Inscriptions refers to words carved into stone. It's just engraved patterns like that. And the form of Greek letters used here is clearly the style that was used after the year 365. But actually, this ends up weakening the argument. Why? Because it proves that there was still normal human activity after the year 365. Normally, after an earthquake or disaster, in theory, there shouldn't be any more records here, or the whole place should have been destroyed. However, option E tells us that there was still some normal human activity after 365, such as writing inscriptions and so on. It suggests that the place might have still been doing just fine after 365. So option E is actually relatively weak. It's also somewhat irrelevant because using inscriptions can't really prove anything. You can't prove whether there was an earthquake or not. And it doesn't even say what was written in the inscription, right? So this option kind of falls between being a weakener and being irrelevant. We can interpret it as irrelevant because you're just talking about inscription, but that inscription has nothing to do with the earthquake. We could also consider it as a slight weakener. Why? Because the inscription suggests that there were still people living there at the time. If there were still people there, it means that maybe, just maybe, nothing catastrophic had happened. But in any case, no matter how you compare, option B is still the strongest answer. So for this question, let's clarify its position. For everyone, what is it? Pay attention when a new concept appears in the conclusion. In this question, it's obvious. Earlier, it only mentioned discovering traces of an earthquake, and that the earthquake caused a fault in the original site. But then, it jumps to telling me it was the earthquake in the year 365. That sudden addition of a specific time is exactly the new concept that appears in the conclusion. When you notice that the conclusion sneaks in a new concept that wasn't present in the previous evidence, your task becomes very clear. You need to prove that this new concept is actually connected to the earlier evidence. In this case, the thing that was snuck in is the time, right? So we need to prove the consistency in terms of time-temporal alignment. You can't use evidence from after the year 365 to prove something about 365 itself. And you also can't claim that it existed both before and at the same time. But if you say that it existed before 365 and not after, then that's the second method we just talked about, which is the absence of evidence. This can be used to make your case. Now, let's look at the last question. It says, an unusual severe winter occurred in Europe after the continent was blanketed by the blue haze resulting from the eruption of the Laka volcano in the European Republic island. In the summer of 1984, so in the summer of 1984, in the Republic of Iceland in Europe, so for a sentence like this, if it's so long that after reading it, you don't know how to understand it, you can try reading it backwards, because the word order in Chinese and English is often opposite. For example, in Chinese, we might put things like location and time at the beginning or the end, right? But in English tends to put them at the end. So you can first look at the time and place at the end, the summer of 1984, and then in this case, the Republic of Iceland, Europe. Then there was a volcanic eruption, and then resulting from. English often puts the cause at the end and the result at the beginning. So the result caused by the volcanic eruption should be placed at the beginning Europe. There was a severe winter. So why did it cause certain things? It was because of the blue haze. So to put it simply, this sentence means that at a certain point in time, there was a volcanic eruption in the Republic of Iceland in Europe. The volcanic eruption caused the blue haze, and this blue haze covered the entire European continent, which then led to an unusual winter in Europe. Finally, the conclusion drawn is, it is evident that major eruptions cause the atmosphere to become cooler than it would be otherwise. He says that it's clear these major volcanic eruptions note here is not just referring to this one eruption, but rather all major volcanic eruptions. You can see that he doesn't say the eruption. If he had used the eruption, it would refer to the eruption mentioned earlier in the article. But here, there's no definite article used, and it's in the plural form, which means it's not referring to just this particular eruption, but rather to all similar major volcanic eruptions around the world. It seems that this kind of volcanic eruption will lead to, what will it lead to? It will cause the entire atmosphere to become colder, which in turn will make the Earth cooler. So today, let's take a look at this. This question asks, if which of the following is true, then the guilt can be lessened. If we want to move toward lessening the guilt, think about it. First, earlier in the passage, the evidence used was the appearance of winter. And then the vast European continent was shrouded in blue smoke produced by the volcanic eruption. Is the connection in the middle made through a cause and effect relationship? No, it's not. The logic used here is a temporal relationship. The volcano part is indeed a cause and effect relationship. So you don't need to doubt that the volcanic eruption produced the smoke that shrouded the area. Don't need to question that. From the volcanic eruption to the blue smoke covering the continent, this is definitely a cause and effect relationship. However, the smoke shrouding the continent and the unusually cold winter, these two things, it's not a cause and effect relationship. It's just a sequence in time. So here, we need to pay attention to the issue of chronology, whether the timing is the same, and then is there an alternative explanation, right? Maybe at that time, it was actually due to other reasons that caused the climate to become colder. And the volcanic eruption just happened to occur at the same time. The volcano didn't actually contribute to the climate change, right? That's the first direction to consider. The second direction is to check whether the timing is actually consistent, right? Okay, let's take a look at the options. What is option A? It says pay attention. We want to weaken the cooling effect caused by the volcanic eruption in 1985. It was offset by an abnormal warming of the Pacific Ocean. You might be thinking, Dusty, doesn't that mean that after the volcanic eruption, the temperature wouldn't drop? You might think, doesn't that basically mean it's a weakening? You might be thinking, weren't we just trying to prove that volcanic eruptions cause temperatures to drop? And then option A is telling us that after a volcanic eruption, the effect might be offset by something else. The warming effect, so the temperature wouldn't drop afterwards. So option A is not only not proving the point, but actually reinforcing it. Why is that? Let's take a closer look at what the conclusion is saying. The conclusion is that volcanic eruptions cause cooling, that volcanic eruptions cause a drop in temperature. there will be a cooling effect, meaning that volcanic eruptions contribute to the factor of temperature drop. So what does option A say? Option A says that volcanic eruptions themselves have a cooling effect. Doesn't that already prove that volcanic eruptions cause cooling? You might say, but isn't that effect offset in the end? Let me ask you something. Whose responsibility is it to offset? The offset is due to something else, in other words. It's the responsibility of the Pacific Ocean currents, right? It's the ocean currents' responsibility. So this is still counted as an effect of volcanic eruptions. It's one of the causal relationships. Let me give you an example. You say, okay, I work hard. The money you earn, you work hard, earn money, and then what happens? In the end, because of Trump's tariff war, the stock market crashes and you lose everything. So would you say that working hard is useless? You have to look at individuals separately. Why? Because in the end, the fact is your money didn't actually increase. That's the final fact. But in this process, what are the two factors behind the fact that your money didn't increase? And which ones cancel each other out? You work hard and earn money, that's one thing. Trump's tariff war causing the crash and making you lose money, that's another thing. You can't use the fact that you didn't make money in the end to prove that working hard is meaningless. Working hard still has its value. Okay, so working hard is still connected to making money. There is still a causal relationship there. So in the end, if you didn't make money, it's not because you worked hard. The reason you didn't make money is because of Trump. But everyone understands, right? Even though there are factors like Trump's tariffs. So it's the same in this case. You can't use the fact that in the end, the earth didn't warm up. You can't use the fact earth didn't get colder to prove volcanic eruptions didn't contribute to cooling. This sentence already states they do contribute to volcanic eruptions make earth cooler. If earth didn't end up getting colder afterward, it's because of other reasons. So you can't deny or prove volcanic eruptions didn't contribute to earth cooling. That's a different issue. Other factors came in and interfered later. Volcanic eruptions themselves still played a role in cooling earth. Things changed, but there was still contribution. It's like what we just discussed. In the end, if you didn't make money, that's because of the trade war. But does working hard still give you the chance to earn money? It still can. So you have to look at each factor separately. Option B says, statistically speaking, there are some strong opinions like volcanic eruptions or severe rainy seasons, but that's not the point. What we're trying to prove today is change. So why are you talking to me about the rainy season? Whether it's cold or whether it rains are two different things. So option B is completely illogical. So option A is also incorrect. And option B is wrong too. Option A tends to strengthen, while option B just doesn't make sense at all. So what about option C? Option C says, a few months after a certain volcano erupted in 1982, the temperature in that region was still at a high point. In fact, if we look at the long-term trend, it was still on the higher side. In other words, this proves that after a volcanic eruption, the temperature would consistently drop, but in reality, the temperature remained high. So we might keep option C. Why? Because if the passage wants to prove that these two things are connected to, prove that a volcanic eruption leads to cooling, the evidence presented would be, look, after the volcanic eruption, the temperature dropped. So I believe there is a causal relationship between these two events. But if you only have this one piece of evidence, you need to connect it to all the major eruptions in the world. If you want to claim that all of them have this effect, shouldn't you provide me with more evidence? So what does option C actually give us? It provides us with additional evidence showing that other evidence contradicts it. Let me explain this again. The only evidence you have in the blue section is that after the volcanic eruption in Iceland, Europe became colder. But your final conclusion is trying to argue that it's not just this one volcanic eruption, but that all major volcanic eruptions will have this effect. So if you use just one piece of evidence to generalize to a universal conclusion, don't you think that's too little? So how do we weaken it? It's simple. Just need to prove that this piece of evidence itself isn't representative. If you want to support it, then you need to prove that other evidence is consistent with yours as well. It's the same after volcanic eruption, the weather gets colder. If you want to weaken this, it's simple. I just need to show you a counterexample, like a volcanic eruption where the temperature didn't change. Option C is exactly such a counterexample. So what approach does option C take? It addresses the issue of vanity. Your source is singular. I can easily refute your point with just a single counterexample. Option C is about the so-called fallibility issue. So what about the multiple choice options? Let's keep option C for now. It does indeed provide a minor weakening, as it shows that your evidence can easily be contradicted by an opposing example. Now, the multiple choice option mentions this major volcanic eruption. The resulting climate effects temporarily masked or offset the global rise in carbon dioxide, that is, the warming effect of greenhouse gases. Aren't you mixing two issues together here? Just like in option A. What we're trying to prove today isn't that. It's the final question whether the Earth's temperature ultimately increased or decreased. We're not just looking at the end result. Our conclusion is to prove whether volcanic eruptions have a negative contribution to temperature. We want to demonstrate this causal relationship. Just like I mentioned earlier, we're not trying to prove whether your savings increase or decrease by the end of this year. What we want to prove is whether your hard work has had a positive impact on your wealth. You tell me that your savings ended up decreasing, but if we look at it closely, we find that what increased your savings was your job, and what decreased your savings was Trump's property tax. In this case, can we really argue or claim that your job had no value to your savings? We can't. So it's the same with the stew option. We're not trying to make a comprehensive judgment because what we want is to look at things separately. We're not trying to prove whether the climate is actually warming or not. What we want to prove is whether volcanic eruptions contribute to climate cooling. This question is very important. So for example, if the conclusion changes a bit, let's say the conclusion here is changed to there has already been a volcanic eruption this year. So next year will definitely get colder. What they're looking for isn't that. It's not about causality. All they want to say is, oh, this year we've had some other volcanic eruptions, and we're certain that next year will be colder. They're not using British jurisdiction. They're just asking whether this thing will happen in the future. In this case, we can consider it, right? Just like I mentioned earlier. All right, so if I say, I've worked really hard this year, so by the end of the year, I will definitely make a lot of money. I'm not talking about who contributed what. We're just discussing whether making a lot of money can happen. But in this case, we can directly say that hard work can indeed help you make money. That's true. But maybe this year there are trade wars, the stock market is unstable, or there are other crises. And in the end, when you add up all these crises, even if hard work does bring positive value to making money, in the end, you still face competition because there are other factors involved. Do you understand what I mean? That's why I keep saying everyone needs to carefully look at the logical relationships in the article. Now, option A says that after a certain volcanic eruption, the ocean temperature started to drop 3 months later. But doesn't this actually support the idea that the volcanic eruption caused a drop? How does that weaken the argument? So the correct answer should be option C. For this question, what I ultimately hope you take away is this. Please listen carefully. What I hope you take away which is first, when we look at this sentence, we pay a lot of attention to it. The conjunctions used are very important. In CR critical reasoning, every conjunction is crucial, especially those that express contrast, condition, or temporal relationships, like in this case. We need to be very clear about this. In the original text, a temporal relationship is used here, but just because one event happens before another doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship. Here, we can see this very clearly. Second, you need to be very clear about what the conclusion is expressing. Just like the logic we discussed earlier, if today the conclusion is trying to prove whether volcanic eruptions contribute to cooling, that's what you need to focus on. What we need to focus on is not whether there will ultimately be a change, but rather on the contribution made in the middle part. It's just like I mentioned earlier, if I want to prove whether hard work has a positive impact on my wealth, what we should be looking at is not whether your savings have increased or decreased by the end of the year. Even if your savings have increased, we need to see whether it came from winning the lottery or from your work, right? If your savings increased, but it was all from winning the lottery, then that increase can't prove that your work contributed. If your savings decreased, it might be because the stock market crashed. In that case, your work is still making a positive contribution to your savings, right? So if you want to prove this causal relationship, we can't just use the outcome as proof. Next, what's the third point is what we just talked about. Pay attention to how you write the conclusion. If in the conclusion here, we don't state a causal relationship and only say that there was another volcanic eruption this year, so we believe something will definitely change next year, then that's different. Why? Because we haven't proven which one is contributing to the other. We're just looking at whether the result will occur or not. So we can say that even though there was a volcanic eruption this year, there could be other things that cause the Earth to warm up. In the end, no matter who contributes how much, what I ultimately want to see is that the temperature doesn't necessarily improve. So everyone, we see that CRT is actually much more complicated than you might think. Reading ability is extremely important. That's why when I interview middle school students, I always make sure to use a lot of assessments. Every interview includes a reading ability test, and I regularly require them to do reading comprehension training because this skill is extremely, extremely important. Just because a CR passage is short doesn't mean it's simple. Just like I demonstrated earlier, Even changing one or two words can make a huge difference in logic, so you all need to be especially careful about. The takeaway from this concept is that in the world of archaeology, it's always the evidence that speaks. It can even speak. But the question is, what exactly does the evidence say? And how does it connect to the conclusion? The key lies in the logical connection in between. How are they linked together? And those logical connections are the 5 methods we discussed earlier.